Welcome to the 5-part video series discussing important concepts related to installing SBM. As a review, in Part 1 we explored the SBM architecture and installation strategies. In Part 2 we prepared our database servers and created empty databases to hold our SBM tables. And this time we will run the installer and connect to the databases. During the last video, we downloaded the SBM installation file and the patch that was available for our version. We'll talk about the patch later. For now, we're going to focus on the main installer. The first thing you want to do is unzip the installer into a clean folder, which I already did here. And then we can drill in, and you will see that we have two folders here. The first one is the client folder. This is the installer for Composer. Composer will be automatically installed on the server, but this is a copy just in case you want to also install it on your local machine in addition to it being on the server. But the main installer is here in the Suite folder. To start the installation, we will go into the Suites folder and double-click on setup.exe. If the system asks if you want to run the file, just click Run. Once the wizard has started, you will get this welcome message. Just press Next. Then you will get the end user license agreement, which you can read and then accept. Next, you are prompted to verify the installation folder. If you need to install it in a different location, just click Change. Otherwise, click Next. On the last screen, just click Install and the installation will begin. If you are prompted about a reboot, just go ahead and click OK. The installer will continue copying files and updating the system. I will zip through the installer for this recording, but your installation will take about 10 minutes. Sometimes the installer will pause on the status screen. This is normal. Just keep waiting for the install to finish. When the install is finished, you will get this completion page. If you'd like to see the installer log, you can click this box and it will pop up as soon as you finish out of the wizard. To close out, you will press Configure. Because I selected the box, I can see the installation log and I can scroll through to check for errors or any messages. The SBM configurator will also automatically launch. If for any reason it does not automatically launch, you can launch it manually by going to the Start menu and selecting SBM Configurator. The SBM configurator is a simple interface that allows you to configure many of the settings and options for the SBM server. It's very rare that you will need to edit any XML or property files with SBM. Instead, almost everything is configured directly within this interface. The first time you launch the configurator on a new server, it will open in this wizard mode, which will guide you through the basic setup. Let's run through the wizard together. On this first page, we want to give our environment a name. The machine that I'm setting up is a test server, so I'm just going to call this SBM test. And let's click Next. This is the database screen that tells SBM where the database servers are located and the name of the databases where SBM will store its tables. The screen itself is pretty self-explanatory. At the top, you will select the type of database server that you will be using. I'm going to be using a SQL server. This will give you fields to enter in the host name for the server, the instance name, and to give the port number. If you were to select a different type of database, you would get different prompts. For Oracle, we have the host name, the service name, and the port number. For myself, I am using SQL today, so I will switch it back. The name of my SQL server is SBM12, so I will put that in. And I'm not using instances, so I will leave that blank. And my port number is 1433. At the bottom half of the screen, we see places for the 5 different SBM databases. Here we can put in the name of the database that my DBA created for me, as well as the username and password that was set up with access to that database. This is a good place to pause for just a moment and look at our diagram that we used during the last video. Let's assume that we are setting up this type of an environment. We have a test server over here, which will have one SBM server, and our test server database is going to have one repository database, which our DBA called SBM underscore repository, and it will have one runtime database, which is called SBM underscore test. The production environment, which we will also be setting up, is going to have 2 SBM servers, one here and one here, with a load balancer in front, and it will also have one database server. This time it will have one database called SBM prod. As a reminder, we are storing our repository database on the test server, and that is because we only want to have one repository database in this entire setup, and I chose to install it on my test server. You may have chosen to install your repository database on the production server. Either way is fine, but in this sample that we're going to do today, I'm going to put it on my test server. In Configurator for this setup, we will come into our Application Engine area and put in our database name, SBM Test, and we'll put in the username that we set up, and I'm actually going to use the SA username, and we want to put in the password and confirm the password. We can press the test button. Our test connection finished successfully. Now we can take a look at our other databases. As you noticed, once I filled in the top database, it filled in all of the other areas to match. But we need to have our repository separate. We are not going to store it in the same database. Our DBA created a separate database for us called SBM repository. Let me fix that. Okay, and we are also storing our configuration settings in that same database. So I'm going to copy this name and put it down here. And we will click test to verify this name as well. So this gives you an idea how we would set up the test server. I would like to take a moment and just show you what it would be like on this screen for the production server. Remember, for our production server, we will have one database called SBM prod that holds the application engine, orchestration engine, and common log tables. But the repository tables are still going to be stored over here on the test environment. So how do we set that up in Configurator? So for the production server, so how would that look different? Well, first of all of our database names are all wrong. So let's click this little broom over here to clean this up. We'll say OK. The data is all cleared out now. So now what would we do for our production server? We would come over here to host and we would fix this to point to our production database. Let's just put that name in here. And then under the database, we would put in the production database name, which for us is SBM production. And we're going to put in the username again and the password. Okay, and this time I'm just pretending, so this test connection's not going to work, but let's just continue on. Now remember that our repository this time is going to be stored on our test server. So changing the name here is not going to work because it does not exist on this server here. What we need to do is grab the repository from the left side here, and we're going to drag it down to the bottom of the screen. It's a little sensitive sometimes to find the right spot. No, that's not working good. Let's get rid of this yellow message so we can see it better. Well, let's just click less up here to shrink that up. There we go. Now we can see it. Okay, so we're going to grab repository from here and drag it down and drop it. Okay, so now we have our second server here. Also in this server, we are going to store our configuration settings. So we're going to grab that and drop it down here as well. Okay, so now we have two different database server connections happening. On the top, we're pointing to our production database server with our production database name and our login information. And we can scroll down here to the bottom, and this one is going to be pointing to our test server. So that one was SBM 12, and we've got our port number, and now we can change our database here. This was going to be called repository. So let's see, repository, and we have it here, and then we'll have to change the name down here as well. Repository. Okay, now we'll be able to go ahead and click the test connect buttons and just validate that these are all connecting to the correct databases. This is just an example, so it's not going to work for me right now, but when you're doing this for real, your test connections will work on your system. So this is what it would look like when you're setting up the production server. I am going to pause for a second and put this back up the way it was because we are working on the test server right now. So let me just fix this back the way it was. And I'm going to clear this out again. And we'll put in here SBM test and put in the password. Okay, and our repository database is called repository. Okay, and the same for our configurations database. Okay, let's make sure I got that all back. We'll test the connections. All right, great, it's all working. Okay, so once we have our database setup configured, we're ready to click next and go on to the next page. The next screen is for the component servers. To understand this screen, we're going to jump back over to another diagram that we used in the last video. Let's pretend for a moment that you are setting up a system similar to this diagram. In here, you'll see that there is one SBM server with all of the components installed. Now let's jump back over to Configurator. To match that diagram, we would leave this screen exactly as it appears here. You'll see that all of the components are listed here under one SBM server. Let's look at another example that's a little bit more complex. With this example, we have two SBM servers. One SBM server is going to host the Tomcat components, and the other SBM server is going to host the IIS components. So let's look and see how we do that in the configurator. To set up two servers, it's going to be similar to what we did on the database screen. We want to separate the different components out, just like we did over there. So this time what we're going to do is separate out, let's say we're going to separate the application engine. We would grab it, and this time we drag it over to the right and drop it. And then the application engine, we wanted to bundle along with the logging services. So let's grab that and drop it over there as well. And also chat ops. So let's grab chat ops and drop it over there as well. Now we have the two servers split out. Our first server hosts all of the Tomcat components, and our second server hosts all of the IIS components. Now that we have these two separated, what you can do to configure them is to select one. Let's say we want to select the Tomcat server. And then down at the bottom of the page, we actually can't see it very well here. Let's make that bigger. Here we go. We'll just drag the center line and pull it up here. Okay, now we can see at the bottom half where we can put in the name of our server. And we can also put in the port numbers that Tomcat's going to be using. There are several options down here. We're not going to cover all of them today, but you can look through the help or the install guide to learn more about them. Similarly, if we select our second server, we could come over here and put the name of that server. Maybe our other server is called, I don't know, SBM IIS. And then the bottom section would give you options to configure the IIS portion. So these will use different port numbers and different options at the bottom. So that's an example where you split the components to be the Tomcat components on one machine and IIS components on a separate machine. Let's try another example just to keep us going. In this example, it's a little bit more complex. In this one, we're going to have two SBM servers, one up here and one down here. And this time we're going to have a load balancer in the front that points to each of these servers. Let's take a look how we do that inside of Configurator. As you saw in the diagram, we had all components installed on both of the two SBM machines. So the first thing we're going to do is put these components back over into our main machine here. We'll just drag and drop them back over there again. Okay. And then you will notice on the bottom half of the screen, we have our configuration options for IIS and for Tomcat. They're all down here now. To make this a load balance system, what we're going to do is scroll down and we're going to click this Join Cluster as Node option. When we click this option, you will see that we get some extra tabs. So what you will do to configure this is first you want to put up here your cluster name. This is the friendly name that your load balance team will give to this setup. So they might call it something super nice like sbm.mycompany.com, something like that. They will give you a nice name, and that's the name that you'll put over here. I'm going to copy this name and we'll go to the Load Balancer tab. We will put the same name here as our host. Next, we will go to the Node tab. Remember in our diagram, we had two nodes. We have one node in here by default, but we can click Add Node on the right to add a second one. So this is where we would put the actual names of our real servers in here. We would put one of the machine names as node 1 and then the other machine name as node 2. Whatever that is, the real machine names, whatever those are, that's what you would put in here. Let's take a look at one more example. In this example, we have two systems. We have our test environment and our production environment. Right now in Configurator, we have something very similar to this production environment setup. We have our components installed and we have a load balancer set up that's pointing to each of the two nodes. But in this example, the repository is separate. The repository is stored on the test environment. Remember, we only want to have one repository. So for this example, let's try switching it up to look more like this diagram. We already have the load balancer portion set up. All we need to do is move the repository to show like this diagram where the repository is on a separate server. So let's do that. So right now in Configurator, we already have the load balance portion set up for our production and system, and we have our two nodes defined. But what we need to do is tell SBM that the repository is going to be hosted on our test server. So what we're going to do is grab the repository component, pull it over to the side. Okay, now we have our second server over here. So over here, we're going to give the name of the server where our test server is installed. Okay, so we would put in that, and then we'd give the port number and other details. Right now, I am just doing a very, very simple setup, and all of my components are going to be installed on one machine. So let me just pull that back over here, and I'm not using a load balancer, so I'm going to come over here and uncheck this clustering option. Okay, so this matches what I'm doing for real right now during our test. I just wanted to show you how this component screen worked and how to drag and drop items. Let's go ahead and continue. We're going to click on Next again. This brings us to the IIS server page. Because IIS is going to be used on this machine, I get a chance to change my port numbers and a bunch of other settings on here. Right now, we're just going to keep it simple and keep the defaults. So I will click Next. Next comes the Tomcat server. Again, we're just going to keep all the defaults for now and keep going through our wizard. So we'll click Next. Next in the wizard is the license server screen, but we actually can't do that part yet because we have not completed our database setup. So there's not really anything we can do here. We'll just go ahead and click Next. The same is true with the authentication portion. We can't do that until we finish with the databases, so we'll just click Next. Same with the mail service screen, so Next. And the common services, so we'll click Next again. Next is the security screen. On this screen, we need to come over. You'll notice that we have a big red error message here saying that we need a certificate. The easiest way to get through this screen is to just come up to the top and click Generate All. And that will generate a certificate for you. We're just going to keep all these defaults and click OK. Once the certificate is generated, you'll get this little pop-up message, which we'll talk more about later. For now, we're just going to click OK past this, and you'll see that our certificate was loaded here in the main portion. All right, let's click Next to continue, and we get this little summary page. On this page, it gives you a few instructions on what you're going to do next. We're going to do these steps on our next videos. So for now, I'm just going to go ahead and skip through this, but you're welcome to read through all of the instructions. So let's go ahead and click Finish. If you get a message about your services that are going to be stopped, just go ahead and click Yes. The system is updating the configuration files all throughout SBM and preparing those files for the next steps. Once it's finished, you will be taken back into Configurator. This time we're not in the wizard mode, we are in standard mode. It will look a little different, but many of the screens will look familiar to you. Just to note, whenever you are in Configurator, if Configurator finds any problems or wants to give you any messages, it will list those messages down here at the bottom. Right now, we have this message telling us to use the System Administrator to create the application engine tables in our database. And that is exactly what we're going to do in our next video. That completes this section on how to install SBM. You might be tempted to install the patches now, but we need to wait until we get a little farther along in the process. Next up, we are going to cover how to initialize an empty SBM database and how to log in for the first time.